Good morning. I've been teaching a class on Dogen Zenji's Genjo Koan at San Francisco Zen Center for the past 3 weeks. And as some of you know, I wrote this book called Meeting Myriad Things, which is a commentary on Genjo Koan, published by Shambhala last year. And so I've been kind of immersed in this text. So Genjo Koan, which I'll talk about the meaning of the title in a minute. Genjo Koan is a text by Dogen Zenji, who was the 13th century founder of Soto Zen in Japan. So he lived from 1200 to 1253. And he was a poet. He wrote amazing essays. He had a deep understanding of the nature of practice, which is sometimes feels very obtuse and difficult to understand. Recently, I've been thinking about this. When I write about the Dharma, this is my second book. When I write about the Dharma, I often am very interested in things like, what does the Japanese mean? What is this person referring to? How does this relate to our everyday practice? But I really try to go into a kind of depth of how we can understand what it is that Dogen was talking about. What do those Zen terms mean? That kind of thing, as well as giving examples of daily practice. But recently I've been thinking about Genjo Koan, and I thought, one of the things about Genjo Koan is it is a primer, essentially, of practice. And Dogen wrote this for a layperson. And he wrote it very early upon returning from China, after he had received certification to be a teacher in the Chaodong lineage in China, which in Japanese means Soto Zen, is how you'd say that in Soto Zen. So he brought this lineage from China to Japan, and now in the United States. Our particular lineage was brought to us by Suzuki Roshi, Shunryu Suzuki, who came to the United States as a missionary for the Japanese Soto Shu to the Japanese temple in San Francisco called Sokoji to minister to the Japanese American community in San Francisco. I think he arrived in 1959. From that arose San Francisco Zen Center, which was started by essentially a bunch of hippies who wanted to practice Zen, and they really weren't kind of fitting in with the Japanese American community at Sokoji, and so they started this thing called San Francisco Zen Center. Zen centers are kind of a hybrid convert monastic practice of the monastic side of Japanese Soto Zen. A Japanese Soto temple, like Sokoji in San Francisco, or Zen Shuji, which is the head temple in Los Angeles, has a different kind of ministry in a way, because it's not so focused on sitting zazen or the kind of formal monastic practice, but it has a different kind of emphasis, which is on lay practice and practice of community and life. So we here at Ocean Gate try to bring this community aspect more into our practice, rather than focusing so much on this kind of hybrid monastic practice that is a characteristic of American Zen centers. So with that introduction, what I want to do is do a series of talks talking about Genjo Koan as a primer for practice, not from the perspective of what did Dogen mean by this phrase, or, what's the Japanese word for this, and that kind of thing, but to actually just look at it as just a Dogen saying, okay, this is how you practice. So remember, this was written, Genjo Koan was written for a layperson. It's part of a series of essays, which are called fascicles, scholarly term, which means something like, I think, a bundle. So this is Dogen actually himself compiled a 75 fascicle version of the Shobogenzo, which means true Dharma eye. And Genjo Koan is always in Dogen's compilations the very first essay that he puts in his compilations, because he believed that this was the key practice of Soto Zen. So the name of the disciple who Dogen wrote this for, Yo Koshu, and they think that probably Yokoshu met Dogen on the ship on the way back from China. I like to imagine that they're out on the deck of a ship. By the way, it's a big deal back in those days to get on a ship and go between China and Japan. The sea is pretty rough, but I could imagine them at night looking at the stars, talking about the Dharma, pretty kind of romantic thing, and getting into doing this. And so when he got back to Japan, Dogen thought, oh, I'm going to write this text for Yokoshi and try to explain to him in a very concise way my understanding of how it is that we do this practice. Okay, so let's look at Genjo Koan from that position. Okay, Genjo Koan basically means the ultimate truth or principle of practice of Buddhism, actualized. Genjo means actualized, Koan means truth or principle. So Genjo Koan is the ultimate truth or principle of Buddhism actualized. One of Dogen's students said, you can say Genjo Koan of anything. You can say Genjo Koan of driving your car. Well, since he lived in the 13th century, he didn't say that. But we could say that. Genjo Koan of drinking tea, Genjo To of walking your dog, etc. Okay, so how does he start this out? He starts out by saying, we have to begin by studying the Dharma from what's called a relative position. We have to start studying the Dharma by kind of labeling aspects and ways of thinking and understanding our lives. And so Dogen says, we ask ourselves about the meaning. By the way, when I say this, I'm reading my notes. This is not how Dogen put it. But we have to talk about delusion and awakening. These are questions that we ask ourselves in practice. What's delusion and awakening? What's practice? What's birth? What's death? What's delusion? What's realization? What's the relationship between delusion and realization? So this starts out usually the way that we inquire about the nature of Buddhist practice. Maybe you have a different kind of way of labeling this, but we have these questions that we have about the nature of our experience. And we are being asked to put them in a Buddhist context using kind of a Buddhist way of a worldview. So he starts out here and he says, what is delusion and realization? So I think this is a big question for us when we start out, especially what does it mean to say, what do we think delusion is, or what do we think enlightenment is? So I think the first question, usually when I started out practicing, it was like, how can I be enlightened? And how fast can I be enlightened? Yeah. When I went to Tassajara to do the monastic practice, I said, well, okay, I'll give myself 5 years. I figure in 5 years I ought to be enlightened. Now, what did I think enlightenment was? Well, I thought enlightenment was, well, first of all, I would be able to sit zazen like gangbusters. I would never hurt. I could sit for hours in full lotus, everything like that I'd just do that, like rolling off a log. But also, the other thing is every difficulty that I had in my relationships would be immediately cleared up. There would be no more conflict, no more problems. Nobody would ever get in my face about anything, and they would love me, and I'd be great, and I'd be full of wisdom and everything like that. So that was like my goal. That was enlightenment, and I had this 5-year plan. I didn't really have a steps and stages plan. I just had this plan. I would go to the monastery. I would do this thing. What I discovered at the monastery was I brought every piece of baggage, psychological baggage, with me to the monastery. So I had the same problems with all these people. There was one woman I just hated. So it was like, this all came with me. My anger came with me, my everything, And guess what? I couldn't sit full lotus indefinitely all day long. I couldn't even sit full lotus. And not only that, it's like, we do this thing when you start in the monastery called Tangaryo, where you go and you sit from like 5:45 in the morning till 9 o'clock at night with a couple of breaks for dinner and stuff. But mostly you're sitting. And oh, by the way, everybody else leaves, they turn off the lights, take the heater out, and you're there. I think, with 5 other people. So there we sit. There were flies all over the place. I was convinced I was the only person with flies around them, but it turned out that everybody thought they had flies around them. And then I decided I had this bright idea. I'd get a fly strip and put it down on my seat, and the flies would get stuck on it. So I did that, but then I got really worried. What would my karma be like if I killed a fly? So it's like, then I had that to be anxious about. And plus the fact it hurt like hell. So I would be sitting there saying, how are we now? Are we okay now? Yes, I'm okay now. How about now? Are you okay right now? Yeah, I think I'm okay right now. How about now? Are you okay? And I did that for like 40 minutes until we got up to walk for 10 minutes. So anyway, it wasn't going to plan, this plan about being enlightened. So I think, we have these ideas. We come to practice with these ideas about what it means to be enlightened. And then we have ideas about delusion. Well, delusion is bad, enlightenment is good. So delusion is like, I've got to get rid of it. Now, the problem is, most of the time, just like enlightenment, we don't know what delusion is. We don't have a clue what it is, because usually delusion arises from some kind of desire that we have to alleviate our suffering. We do it in some way that's harmful to ourselves and others. It's kind of like, in a way, like an addiction. Like, why do we, if you're an alcoholic or you're addicted to food or whatever it is, right? Why do you do it? You do it because you think it's going to alleviate your suffering. But then you find out, no, this doesn't alleviate my suffering. It actually makes it worse. And then, in order to kick whatever this habit is that I thought was going to make me feel good in the first place, it turns out it's really hard to do. So the attachment to self is this way in which we become addicted, in a way, to the self, to making ourselves feel better based on ideas that actually are delusional and not particularly helpful. But then we find out, oh, in order to change this, it's really hard. So these are things that questions that arise for us, at this beginning, when Dogen's talking about delusion. What is delusion? What is realization? How do we understand this? And then there's practice. What is practice? You're asking about, like, what in the world are you people doing here? What is this practice that we're engaged in? So we have formal practice, which is we come to the Zendo, we do ritual, we do everything we're doing in the Zendo is essentially ceremony. Zazen, and you can think of Zazen as ceremony. All the coming in and bowing and doing things that we do. We actually do ceremonies. We do Buddha's birthday. We have service during the weekdays after Zazen. So we're doing this practice. But then there's the practice of, how are you practicing in your daily life? The practice of, how are you relating to other people? The practice of, how do you take care of things? All those other practices arise in our tradition, that we name. So what we're talking about here is the way we talk about our practice, our understanding Buddhism, by naming things, naming delusion, naming realization, naming this, naming that, doing ritual, all those things that we do that we call something, right? And we have forms. Why do we do forms? Like, why do we bow to and from our cushion? Why do you put your hands up in gasho when we're offering incense? Like, why do you do this stuff? Because some people hate this stuff. There was one guy at the monastery, so this is called shashu. When you stand like this, it's kind of like an at ease position in Soto Zen, standing in shashu. He couldn't stand standing in shashu. Why? Because he felt like, you're in the army now, that kind of thing. Like, he hated that, being told what to do. So he'd like be walking around like this, doing his thing, which, by the way, if you're a Buddhist priest, that's tough to walk around like that without being in shashu. So it really helps to, keep track of those sleeves. But So there's this practical side of it, but he hated that. And so whenever we go serve, when you're in the monastery and you're serving food up in the Zendo, we'd all be standing around like this, and he'd be standing around like this, waiting for it. But you know something? He did it. He stayed. He did the practice. So there are things we're going to be deeply resistant to. At San Francisco Zen Center, I haven't been doing this lately because I'm getting old and infirmed and my back is bothering me, but you do 9 bows before service. When I was first started out, I was like, 9 bows? I can't stand 9 bows. It's like I would go 1, 2, 3, 4, like this, about these bows. So there's always something. You come to practice, there's always going to be something that you probably don't like about the ritual. But you know what? We do it anyway. And one of the reasons we do it is because over time it changes. Things start to percolate and become transformative. And the things that we really didn't like, all of a sudden we start to realize why we're doing them and how they're efficacious. Because they're certainly not going to hurt you. Doing 9 bows was not going to, cause me some kind of psychological damage. I just didn't like doing 9 bows for whatever reason. I just probably didn't want to be told what to do. So it's like, but you keep doing it and you keep doing it. There's a Zen axiom about how you walk across a field and you start out, usually it's about robes, but we can talk about your pants. You start out, your pants are dry. By the time you get to the other side of the field, you're wet up to your knees and you don't really know how that happened, right? That's what it's like to practice. Just keep walking through the field. So Dogen says this practice, we're talking about here about practice. I want to kind of keep track of where I am in the text. So I want to look at the actual text here. Okay, so then there's a question of birth and death. What that he brings up, he says, well, what's birth and death? So we can think about birth not like giving birth to children, but more like, how do things come about? How do things happen? What's causation in Buddhism? What does it mean when we talk about karma? What is karma about? How is it that some relationships or problems arise and other ones don't arise? How is it that I am who I am as opposed to being somebody else? So we just have a lot of questions about these things. And how do we approach these questions from a Buddhist point of view? So practice is also about that. We also ask questions about how do things end? What is death? And not just the big question about what is death, but the question of how do things end? How is it that I'm, how do I relate to impermanence? Mostly relate to impermanence like it's a bad thing. But actually, impermanence is a really great thing because without impermanence, we would be in deep trouble. Impermanence is all those chemical responses in your brain that allows me to talk and you to listen. Impermanence is all of the things that is process and interacting. But mostly we relate to impermanence as, okay, something's good happening and I don't want it to end. And hopefully we also remember that when bad things happen, they do end. But we usually get caught in trying to hold on to the latter. So all of these questions are really deep questions about the nature of our lives, about how it is that we engage in our lives. So these are big questions, and we want to know how to negotiate suffering. I don't know about you, but I came to practice because I was suffering. If I had not been suffering, I would not have done this practice. This practice is hard. There's an aspect to Zen that's hard. If you really do this practice, it asks of you that you let go of some of your cherished beliefs, that you let go of some of your cherished things about yourself, that maybe you let go of some of your likes and dislikes, in a way that are things that define yourself to yourself. So there are ways in which the practice is really hard. Sometimes it's really hard to apologize for something that you know you should be apologizing for, but that other part of you is going like, wait a minute, I'm not going to apologize. I know I'm wrong, but I'm not going to apologize because that person doesn't deserve my apology. I don't like that person, and I'm not going to make myself vulnerable by apologizing to that person. Wait a minute, can we actually do that? Isn't that hard? Don't you? I find that difficult. So it's like, can we do that hard practice? So practice is alleviating our suffering actually is not as easy as we might think it is. So I came to practice because I was suffering. I was trying to figure out a way to negotiate my life. I mentioned this at a talk at San Francisco Zen Center. And during the Q&A, a woman said, well, I came to practice to save all beings. I came to practice because I wanted to do, I was going to, like bestow my benevolence on everybody around me. More power to her. I'm happy for her. But for me, I came to practice because I couldn't figure out anything else to do. So it was kind of like, uncle, I'm laying on the ground with my tongue hanging out. I can't think of anything better that I could do, so I'm going to do practice because some part of me said, yeah, that's a thing you might be interested in doing. Why don't you go do that? So I did that. And then it resonated for me in some way that I don't know, a hard thing, just a hard thing. Zazen was hard. And San Francisco Zen Center was scary. Everybody wore black robes, everybody in the Zendo. No talking, lots of forms. Everybody was turning in one direction and you'd be turning in the wrong direction. It was like all this stuff was going on and you had no clue about what it was. And the lights were kind of dim. I remember one teacher had the lights so dark you couldn't see the Zafus in the Zendo. So it was like, it was scary. But somehow I managed to get through it because there was something about it that compelled me to want to do this practice. I remember the first time I went to service upstairs in the Buddha Hall. I had avoided it for a couple of months, I think. And I had a friend who was there and we said, oh, wow, I'm so scared. I don't want to go up and do practice up in the Buddha Hall because I don't know I don't know when to bow. I don't know when to do this. What if I turn the wrong way? What if I don't do this? What if I don't do that? Because lightning could come down and strike you. It's like something terrible could happen. And it's like, so we said, okay, we'll go together. We'll stand next to each other. We'll go in there and hopefully nobody will hit us with a rubber hose. It will be okay. So we went in there and we got in there and sure enough, it was okay. Nobody yelled at us and we got through service and it was actually kind of cool. And so after that, we would go upstairs and go to service. So hopefully we're trying to avoid that here at Ocean Gate. We're trying to avoid this like, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to me if I do the wrong thing? And to tell you, nothing's going to happen. Nothing bad is going to happen. You're okay. So, but anyway, I just felt this deep heart connection to the practice, even though initially I thought it was scary. And initially I had reservations about it and I wasn't so sure exactly what was going on, but I was willing to suspend my disbelief and to just go ahead and do this the best I could, which of course is never good enough, because it's just, this is what life is like. You're always, well, at least I am, you're always trying to be perfect or whatever it is. And we can't do that. You're not going to be perfect. What is perfect? I mean, really, what is perfect? There's no such thing as perfect. So there's this way that you just feel this heart connection, just do your best, just come here and be yourself and it'll all be okay. So, Dogen says, okay, well, and then he says, oh, there are Buddhas and there are living beings. Okay. I remember somebody said when I first came to practice it, when you sit, you are Buddha. I thought, I don't feel like Buddha. I don't feel like Buddha at all. I just am me sitting here having my thoughts, being in pain. Sometimes the period would go by super fast. Sometimes it would go by really slow. And then I'd be so glad the bell rang. It would be like, just, it's like every day was a new thing. It's still every day is a new thing for me, Every time I get up and officiate for service, it's a new thing. It's really amazing. Sometimes if I just have a thought that isn't paying attention to a chant that I've chanted a bazillion times, I get it wrong. You know, I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha. Somehow between Buddha and Sangha, I can say Sangha instead of Dharma. Like you'd think that would be like so ingrained, but no, I have to pay attention to what I'm doing. So there's this way in which everything's new, everything's different all the time. But what is a Buddha? What is Buddha? You know what Dogen says about that? He says, don't worry your pretty little head. And he didn't say it that way, of course, but he said the ideas that we have about what a Buddha is are inevitably wrong. When we first start to practice, they're inevitably not correct. So he said, so essentially let that go. But then a couple paragraphs later, he says, but actually having those ideas isn't necessarily a bad thing, because when you have those ideas, it motivates you to keep practicing when it's hard, like my 5-year plan, right? I mean, I had to give up the 5-year plan, but it took me a while to give up the 5-year plan. In the meantime, I had this 5-year plan. So the 5-year plan, in a sense, was good because it was kind of a motivating factor. And then by the time I figured out that, well, maybe it wasn't actually going to happen that way, I was already hooked. So at that point, it's like I didn't care about the 5-year plan anymore. So there's this way in which Dogen's saying, well, you know, kind of forget about the ideas you have about being a Buddha. And one of the big ideas that we have is that it's about us. But actually, the mind of Buddha is about all of reality. All the mind of Buddha is it means that we are not separate from the whole total functioning of the world. That's all the mind of Buddha is. Everyone, the worst person that you can think of, has the mind of Buddha. The question is, because they are not separate from all of reality, the question is that mind of Buddha functioning, right? Are we functioning with that mind? Are we functioning with the awareness that we're in this total interconnected mandala of life? And out of that comes compassion and skillful means. Are we functioning from that position? We are not separate from that position. And that's why Dogen says delusion in realization. That interconnection is realization, but delusion is not separate from that. Delusion is still in the midst of reality itself functioning, that's all. So that's when we say we're always Buddha. We always have the capacity because we already are that thing. And that's why in just a moment, we can bring forth Buddha mind. And you do bring forth Buddha mind. You just don't call it that. And then there's sentient beings. So who are sentient beings? Sentient beings are, as the Jaku has told us about, the Jodo Shin, foolish human beings. We're just, a bunch of bumbling, foolish human beings trying to get through our lives together, doing our thing. But yet we are still Buddhas, actualizing Buddhas who do not even know that they are Buddhas, as he says later in Genjo Koan. So we don't have to think too much about this. Just have to do the practice, have faith. That's all. Keep coming, do your thing, and don't worry about being a Buddha or a sentient being, because really, it's like I don't think that's the point, is to label ourselves this or that. So then he says, so he's talked about what we call, this is what we would call the relative position, in the sense that we're naming things as being this or that. And then Dogen does what he likes to do, which is all of a sudden he flips the table on us and he starts talking about things being the non-dual aspect of practice. So he's still talking about practice, but now he's talking about a coin. Let's talk about a coin. Coins have two sides, right? There's one side of a coin and the other side of the coin. So one side of the coin is, from a Buddhist perspective, in this case, is the relative. It's things we can name, talk about, etc. And then the other side is what we call the non-dual side, the absolute side. But both of these things are just aspects of the same thing, the coin. So if we're going to talk about, non-duality, which is to say nothing is disconnected, everything is interconnected, everything is in process, everything is this whole mandala of reality itself playing out. Everything is, in some ways, you can't say where one thing ends and another thing begins. That's one way we talk about the nature of reality. And then the other way is Buddha, delusion, realization, all of these words that we have, birth and death and all of that stuff. So that's the coin. My question is, how are we going to spin that coin? And that's our practice. That's practice realization. That is practicing to express our Buddha mind, not practicing to get our Buddha mind. It's practicing. Practicing is an expression of our Buddha mind. Why do we practice? Why are you drawn to doing this? Why are we drawn to anything that's efficacious? We don't have to label it Buddhism or Catholicism or Judaism, or we don't have to label it atheism or anything, right? Or agnosticism or whatever it is. It doesn't have to have a label. It's just how do we do this world together, right? That's how we spend the coin. And so the labels are, in some ways, are important. There's different currencies, right? But in Buddhism, we talk about one side being relative, and that's what Dogen just talked about. And the other side is the non-dual, which is now what he's going to talk about here in Genjo Koan. So here is where he says, well, at times when the married dharmas are not the self, there is no delusion, no awakening, no Buddhas, no living being, no birth and no death. So now he's saying no inherently existing birth, no inherently existing death. So he's reminding us that all of these things are boundless. All of these things are interconnected. All of these things go beyond labels. And they are things just arising and falling. It's this non-dual perspective. So we try to see the world as not just one thing or the other, but we try to hold both of these views simultaneously. It's an interconnected process. It's about becoming and dissolution, happening and functioning, not knowing when one begins. It's a kind of spaciousness. It's a way of the spaciousness interbeing that is arising and presencing. This, in a way, is what we're doing in Zazen, right? It's Hartu says form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form itself is not different than emptiness. Emptiness itself is not different than form. This is a coin. This is reality itself. Form, emptiness, not different. Same thing, same coin, are both functioning. This is the Dharma. So our life, how we live our life is predicated on going beyond saying this or that, going beyond birth and death, no inherently birth and death, that kind of thing, and just living your life, just responding to your life as it arises. That's one of the main activities of Zazen, is really just being present for what's happening in that moment. That's all. Hey, that's hard to do, right? And it's hard to do in your daily life too, because all this stuff gets in the way. Our ideas about things, how things should be, what we want to have happen, what we don't want to have happen, blah, 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 blah. And so when we come to Zazen, even though it's hard, it's kind of like we've cleared the decks a little bit. There is some interacting going on, like if somebody next to you is, clicking in the back of their throat. I'll tell you a little story. San Francisco Zen Center. I was there for 17 years. So I have lots of stories. San Francisco Zen Center, we're doing a one-day sitting from 5 something in the morning till 9 o'clock at night. They have radiators. These are gone now, but they used to have radiators in the ceiling of this building in the Zendo, which was built by Julian Morgan as a place for young Jewish women who were single to live so they could work in the city. Anyway, so this originally was a theater, and they had radiators in the ceiling, and the radiators, when they were turned on, would make these kind of clicking, gurgling sounds and stuff. So we're sitting Zazen, and there's this clicking sound going on throughout most of the day. And I'm sitting there and I'm like going, okay, it's the radiators doing this clicking sound. So I go upstairs after the sitting's over because I lived in the building. And there were these people up in this area called the small kitchen, which is where everybody drank tea and stuff. And people were so pissed. They were like, well, so and so, he was making, you know, that thing you could do in the back of your throat when you've got postnasal drip or whatever, that kind of clicking sound. Well, I guess there was this person in the Zendo who had that going on, and they were doing it the whole time. I thought it was a radiator. So I just accepted it. No problem. It's the radiator. What are you going to do about the radiator, right? I didn't even think about it. They knew it was a person. And as soon as they knew it was a person, and that person should have stopped. That person was distressing them. It was a problem all day long for them because they knew that somebody was doing that. And it brought up all their feelings about that person. I don't like this person. They're making this noise. They do this kind of stuff. Yeah, da, 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 back and forth. Me, I'm sitting there blissfully going along, thinking it's a radiator. But what's the difference there? You know, what's going on there? I can't say that I was in an enlightened state. I just was in an ignorant state about the nature of where the noise was coming from. But it is an interesting lesson about how our minds function in this way. So, okay, so when I came of age in the 1970s, I had a lot of ideas about non-duality. I was like, I had this hodgepodge of teachings going on. There was teachings about finding oneness with all of reality, communing with the trees, you know, dropping acid and going and sitting outside and looking at the colors and doing all this stuff, you know. I was into Egyptian mythology, and there was this whole thing around stories about these channeling. There was Seth Roberts, who was channeling all this stuff. I mean, there's just like all this stuff going on that was happening. And I'm not saying it was bad, but I'm saying it was a real hodgepodge of stuff. And I would just kind of pick and choose what sort of resonated for me and do that. There was American Indian religion, psychedelics. There was something called Cracking the Cosmic Egg, which was the name of a book. Anyway, so I had all of these ideas about the nature of non-duality, but you know, they had nothing to do with people. They had nothing to do with relating to people. They were all about relating to the cosmos. So I wasn't doing a very good job in relating to people, but I was busy trying to find this cosmic woo-woo, feel-good event that was kind of like, now I'm in my own little bubble and communing with nature or whatever it was. But people, you know, it's like, my goodness, what a problem they were. You know, it's like, that was not okay. And I remember I had a friend, she said, oh, you're just trying to be so holy all the time, but why is it that you yell at people when you're driving your car? And I said, okay, I'm done with this. That's it. So as a lesbian, I just went out and shot pool in the lesbian bars, and I played softball and went out and played soccer. And I said, forget this stuff. Just bring me a good beer. You know, it's like, I'm not interested in this anymore. And then somehow I got caught later, you know, by Soto Zen. But anyway, I had all these ideas about what it was, and also reading my journals. I was so wise in my journals. The reality was I was totally screwed up in my relationships. So you know, and I also thought after I started practicing Buddhism that it was all about non-duality. It was like I was supposed to find emptiness. The whole point of it was to find emptiness, to live in some non-dual place. But I didn't realize that this non-dual place and real life were the same thing. So it was like I was trying to transcend life in some way. Hey, here's the bad news. We can't transcend life. We're in life. You know, we're like the lotus in muddy water. We are standing in the midst of all this suffering and craziness and weirdness that it is to be a human being. So this perspective of non-duality, all it is saying is everything's interconnected. And out of that interconnection arises compassion. Why do we feel compassion? We feel compassion because we feel empathy for others. And how can we feel empathy? Because we're interconnected, because we know what it's like. We know what it's like to grieve. We know what it's like to suffer. We know what it's like to be happy. We know what it's like to feel joy. So that's that interconnection. That's the non-duality. That's the no inherent existing stuff. I mean, it sounds very, woo-woo and highbrow Buddhist doctrine and all this stuff, but really it's just about how is it there we are doing this together? And how do we do this together with equanimity? And how do we understand what it is to be a human being in this world? Okay, and then so then Dogen says, after he's talked about this for all, he says, because from the start, the way of the Buddhas have jumped out from abundance. He says, jumped out. He says, from the beginning, we just jump out from all this doctrine. We jump out from all these ideas. We jump into our lives. We just, we're like a fish, comes up, splashes down, comes up, splashes down. It's like, we're just, come back to your life, come back to your life. You need this foundation. You need this kind of, I think we need this kind of intellectual foundation because it's like a map. It's like, how do we get there? Well, we turn on our Google Maps or whatever, and the person says, turn right, turn left, or whatever. And we look to see how that goes. So we need the map to know where we are. But, the reality is we still have to drive the drive. We still have to walk the walk. We still have to, go around the traffic and deal with all the things that come up. And that's where our practice comes in. Okay, and then the last thing that I want to talk about, by the way, this is only about 10 lines of this whole thing. So this, we'll be going on here. But the last thing I want to say is how he ends this section. And he says, and yet, while all of this stuff that we've been talking about might be so, flowers fall even though we cherish them, and weeds spread even though we hate them. This is it. This is coming back to your life. We pick flowers, they die. We wish they would stay beautiful, and they don't. This is grief. This is death. This is letting go. This is holding on. This is clinging. These are all the emotions that we go through. And then he says, and weeds spread even though we hate them. Delusion, our delusion keeps popping up like weeds. We try to pull it out by the roots. I'm going to get rid of this thing, or I got to get rid of this person in my life, or I've got to get rid of this situation, or whatever it is. But you know what? This is our life. They keep popping up. It's like whack-a-mole. So no matter how many times we whack that mole, another one's going to pop up. And so this practice is about how do you deal with whack-a-mole? How do you deal with the weeds that keep spreading? How do we work with our grief when we don't want our greed, our delusion, our hate, all of those emotions that come up? We have a friend right now whose husband a Sangha member whose husband is in the hospital right now, and he's, was in a motorcycle accident, and he's really in pretty bad shape. All these things are coming up for her. Of course they are, because this is it, man. This is life. This is what we have to deal with. How do we do this? How do we deal with the conflicting emotions where everybody says, oh, well, you should feel this or you should feel that, but you don't feel that. What about your parent dies? And it's like, you love that parent, but you also kind of hated him at the same time. So you go to the eulogy and everybody's like, oh, this person was great. They were wonderful. They were this, they were that. And you're thinking to yourself, who was that person? But you're not allowed to say that, right? But it's like, we have to acknowledge that too. We have to acknowledge that that's happening too. This is what it's like to be a human being. It's complicated. It's complicated. We have these brains that do all this stuff and they're lovely, but they're also a problem, right? They're a problem. So we have to work with this body and this mind that's all one thing. What is Buddha? What is illusion? What is realization? To be continued. Thank you.